Hi, lovely audience. My name is Elsa, and I am the writer behind these stories. Please do share your feedback in the comments and also subscribe our channel. Thanks for watching.
Hercule Poirot and the Murder at the Music Hall. Chapter 1. The Evening of Music. The village of Havenbridge had always been known for its quiet charm, a place where time seemed to move a little more gently, where the evenings settled like a soft melody over the narrow lanes and ivy-covered cottages. But on this particular night there was something different in the air. A subtle anticipation lingered, as though the village itself were holding its breath. The village hall stood at the centre of it all, illuminated by a warm golden glow that spilled out through tall windows and onto the gravel path outside. Inside, the hall had been carefully prepared for the evening's event. Rows of wooden chairs were arranged in neat lines, polished to a soft sheen. A grand chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals catching the light and scattering it in delicate patterns across the walls. The faint scent of aged wood and varnish blended with a hint of perfume and freshly pressed fabric, creating an atmosphere both elegant and nostalgic. At the front of the hall, the stage was set with precision. Music stands stood in orderly formation, their sheets perfectly aligned. Instruments rested quietly in their places, as if waiting for their moment to speak. Seated in the front row were Hercule Poirot and his companion, Captain Hastings. Poirot, impeccably dressed as always, adjusted his cuffs with meticulous care before glancing down at the programme leaflet in his hand. An evening of classical strings performed by Mr. Blake and his students. He tilted his head slightly, his sharp eyes scanning the elegant script. A most refined choice for such a small village, Poirot remarked softly. Hastings smiled. You must admit, Poirot, it's rather charming. A peaceful evening, good music, quite a pleasant change from our usual adventures. Poirot allowed himself a faint smile, though there was something thoughtful in his expression. My dear Hastings, he replied, peace is often an illusion. Beneath the calmest surfaces, one may find the most curious disturbances. Hastings laughed lightly, dismissing the comment as one of Poirot's usual philosophical musings. Around them, the hall slowly filled with villagers. Gentle conversations rose and fell like the murmur of a distant tide. Ladies in elegant dresses and gentlemen in neatly pressed suits took their seats, exchanging polite greetings and quiet laughter. There was an air of familiarity among them, a shared history that bound the community together. The lights dimmed slightly. A hush fell over the room. Then from the side of the stage, Mr. Blake appeared. He was a man of composed presence, his posture straight, his movements measured. As he stepped into the light, a ripple of applause greeted him. He acknowledged it with a modest nod before turning to his students, who stood ready behind him. Poirot observed him closely. There, he murmured under his breath, a man admired, but perhaps not entirely at ease. Hastings leaned closer. What do you mean? Poirot did not answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on Mr. Blake, who was now lifting his instrument, preparing to begin. There is pride, Poirot said quietly, but also fatigue, and something else, something less visible. Before Hastings could inquire further, the music began. The first notes flowed gently into the hall, smooth and harmonious. The sound of strings filled the space, weaving a delicate tapestry of melody that seemed to wrap itself around every listener. It was elegant, controlled, and undeniably beautiful. The audience listened in rapt silence. Poirot closed his eyes briefly, as though absorbing not just the music, but the emotion beneath it. Order, he whispered, precision, discipline. Hastings nodded appreciatively, though his attention was firmly on the performance itself. As the piece progressed, the tempo shifted slightly. The The music grew more expressive, more intense. The students followed Mr. Blake's lead with careful concentration, their movements synchronized, their focus unwavering, and yet something was not quite right. It was subtle at first. A barely perceptible tension in the air, a hesitation too brief for most to notice. But Poirot noticed. His eyes opened. He leaned forward ever so slightly. On stage, Mr. Blake's expression flickered, just for a moment. A shadow passed across his face, quickly masked, but not quickly enough. "Ah," Poirot murmured. Then it happened. A sudden, harsh note shattered the harmony. It was sharp, jarring, completely out of place. The music stopped. For 2 seconds, the world seemed to freeze. No one moved, no one spoke. Then a scream pierced the silence. It came from somewhere near the stage, high and filled with terror. Almost at the same instant, there was a loud, unmistakable sound, something falling. The audience erupted into chaos. Chairs scraped against the wooden floor. Voices rose in confusion and alarm. Some stood, others turned, trying to see what had happened. The orderly calm of moments before had dissolved into panic. Hastings sprang to his feet. "Good heavens, what was that?" But Poirot did not react with the same urgency. He stood slowly, deliberately. His expression had changed, not to fear, but to focus. "Observe, Hastings," he said quietly, his voice steady amid the noise. Through the growing confusion, figures began to move toward the stage. The curtain had partially shifted, revealing glimpses of movement behind it, shadows, hurried gestures, the unmistakable signs of distress. Another voice cried out. Then silence began to fall again, uneven, uncertain, but creeping back as realization spread. Something had gone terribly wrong. Poirot stepped forward, his gaze fixed ahead. "Come," he said. Hastings followed, though his face showed concern. They moved through the crowd, weaving past anxious onlookers and murmuring spectators. The closer they came to the stage, the clearer it became. This was no accident. Poirot stopped just short of the curtain. For a brief moment he did nothing. He simply looked, listened, considered. Then, with quiet certainty, he spoke. "Ah, Hastings." He adjusted his gloves with precise care, his eyes narrowing slightly as he prepared to step beyond the curtain. "This is not merely an unfortunate incident." A pause. Then, in a tone both calm and chilling, "It is the beginning of a most deliberate crime." Chapter 2. The Body. Behind the curtain. The murmur of the crowd faded into a tense, uneasy silence as Hercule Poirot stepped past the half-drawn curtain. Behind him, Captain Hastings followed, his earlier curiosity now replaced by a growing sense of dread. Backstage, the air felt different, heavier, almost suffocating. The warmth and elegance of the hall did not reach here. Instead, there was confusion, scattered movement, and the unmistakable tension of something gone terribly wrong. A small group had already gathered around a figure lying motionless on the floor. Hastings stopped abruptly. Good heavens! Mr. Blake lay on his side, one arm bent awkwardly beneath him, the other stretched outward as though reaching for something that had slipped away. Near his hand an instrument rested on the ground, a guitar, its polished surface now marred by dark streaks, blood. A thin line of it trailed from the back of his head, disappearing into his collar. The wound itself was not immediately visible, but the evidence of violence was unmistakable. Kneeling beside the body was Inspector Collins, his expression grave, his movements efficient. He glanced up as Poirot approached. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot, I did not expect to find you here." Poirot inclined his head slightly. "Inspector, it would seem fate has arranged another meeting for us." under less than musical circumstances. Hastings shifted uneasily. "Is he—" Inspector Collins gave a short nod. "Dead." The word hung in the air. For a moment, no one spoke. Poirot stepped closer, his gaze sharp but composed. He did not rush. Instead, he moved with deliberate care, as though every step carried meaning. He crouched beside the body, his eyes taking in every detail. "The position," he murmured softly. "Unbalanced, sudden." Inspector Collins watched him. A blow to the head, most likely. He must have fallen. "Perhaps," Poirot replied, though there was something in his tone that suggested doubt. His attention shifted to the instrument lying nearby. "The guitar," Hastings said quietly. "It must have slipped from his hand." Poirot did not answer. He reached out, but instead of touching it directly, he leaned closer, examining it with careful precision. Then, very gently, he lifted one of the strings. His expression changed, only slightly, but enough. "Inspector," he said, "I would advise caution." Collins frowned. "Why?" Poirot's voice remained calm. "Because these strings, Miguel, are not as innocent as they appear." Hastings leaned in. "What do you mean?" Poirot tilted the instrument so that the light caught its surface. The strings glinted faintly. "Observe," he said, "they are unusually sharp. Not worn, not frayed. Sharp, almost like blades." Inspector Collins narrowed his eyes. "That's not normal." "No," Poirot agreed. "Not normal at all." He lowered the guitar carefully, ensuring he did not disturb its position. "Now," he continued, "let us consider the victim." With a measured motion, he took hold of Mr. Blake's hand, turning it slightly. Hastings inhaled sharply. There were cuts along the fingers, thin, precise, and disturbingly deep. "Those aren't from a fall," Hastings said. "No," Poirot replied quietly. "They are not." Inspector Collins leaned closer, examining the wounds. "Then what caused them?" Poirot released the hand gently, placing it back as he had found it. "The strings," he said, simply. A silence followed. Inspector Collins straightened slowly. "You're suggesting the instrument itself was used as a weapon?" Poirot rose to his feet. "I am suggesting," he said, "that we are not dealing with an accident." Hastings looked from the body to the guitar, confusion etched across his face. "But why would anyone do such a thing? And here, during a performance?" Poirot clasped his hands behind his back, pacing slowly. "Because," he said, "the stage offers both opportunity and distraction. Everyone is watching, yet no one is truly observing." Inspector Collins nodded thoughtfully. A crowded room, noise, confusion. Yes, it would be easy to act unnoticed. Poirot stopped. "Precisely." For a moment his gaze drifted across the backstage area, the scattered chairs, the open instrument cases, the hurried footprints. Then something caught his attention. Near the edge of the stage, partially hidden beneath a fallen sheet of music, lay a small piece of white fabric. Poirot bent down and picked it up. "A handkerchief," Hastings said. Poirot turned it in his fingers. In one corner, delicately stitched, was a single letter. "C," he read softly. Inspector Collins stepped closer. "Could belong to anyone." "Indeed," Poirot said. "But in matters such as these, even the smallest detail may carry great significance." He folded the handkerchief neatly and handed it to the inspector. "Keep it carefully." As Collins took it, Poirot's eyes shifted once more, this time to the floor leading toward the exit. There, faint but visible, were several crushed petals. White. Hastings followed his gaze. "Flowers?" Poirot moved closer, examining them. "Yes," he said. "White flowers." He straightened, looking toward the corridor beyond the stage. They form a trail. Inspector Collins frowned. A trail? Oui, Poirot replied. From the stage, toward the outside. Hastings looked puzzled. You think someone dropped them while leaving? Perhaps, Poirot said, or perhaps they were carried and lost in haste. Inspector Collins crossed his arms. So we have sharp strings, poison cuts possibly, and now a handkerchief and flowers. Poirot gave a faint smile. A curious combination, is it not? From the hall beyond, voices began to rise again. Questions, whispers, fear spreading among the gathered villagers. Inspector Collins exhaled slowly. I'll have the exit secured. No one leaves until we understand what happened here. A wise decision, Poirot said. He cast one last look at the body of Mr. Blake. Then quietly, almost to himself, he added, performance. Interrupted. His gaze shifted to the guitar. A melody turned deadly. Hastings swallowed. And the killer? He asked. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly, a glint of certainty beginning to form. The killer, my friend, he said, is not far. A pause, then with quiet conviction. In fact, I believe they are still among us. Chapter 3. The Interrogation. Within minutes, the elegant village hall of Havenbridge had transformed into something entirely different. The soft murmur of conversation and music had been replaced by a tense, watchful silence. The doors were closed. No one was permitted to leave. At the far end of the hall, near the stage, a small space had been cleared. It was here that Inspector Collins had decided to conduct his questioning. The four students stood together, though not quite united. There was a distance between them, not physical but emotional. Fear had drawn invisible lines. Edward stood slightly apart, his hands clenched at his sides. Lucy kept glancing around as though searching for an escape that did not exist. Peter shifted his weight restlessly, while Anna remained unnaturally still, her eyes lowered. At a short distance, seated with composed elegance, was Hercule Poirot. Beside him stood Captain Hastings, who watched the scene with growing intensity. Inspector Collins stepped forward. "Let us begin," he said firmly. "No one leaves this hall until we understand what happened." His gaze settled on Edward. "You were closest to Mr. Blake. Tell me exactly what you saw." Edward swallowed, his voice tight. "Sir, I was backstage. I gave him a glass of water just before the performance resumed." Inspector Collins held up the glass, now carefully wrapped in a cloth. "This one?" Edward nodded. "Yes, I think so." The inspector turned it slightly, allowing the light to catch its surface. "There's a faint trace here," he said. "Blood." A murmur rippled through the nearby onlookers. Hastings leaned closer to Poirot. "Blood on the glass?" Poirot did not look at him. His eyes remained fixed on Edward. "Continue," the inspector said. Edward hesitated. "There was nothing unusual, sir. He seemed normal, maybe a little tired." "Nothing else?" Collins pressed. "No, sir." Inspector Collins nodded slowly, then turned to the others. "Anna." She looked up, startled. "You said earlier that Mr. Blake brought his own instruments. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," she replied quietly. "He never trusted anyone else with them." Poirot's eyebrow lifted slightly. "Interesting," he murmured. Inspector Collins continued. "And the guitar?" Before Anna could answer, Edward spoke again. "It had a fault, sir. A couple of days ago, the strings weren't right." "Who handled the repair?" the inspector asked. Peter stepped forward. "Edward and I took it to the shop." "And brought it back?" "Yes, sir," Peter said. "We collected it ourselves." Poirot leaned back slightly in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Ah, responsibility shared," he whispered. Hastings frowned. You think that's important? Poirot replied softly. Everything is important, Hastings. The question is, how important? Inspector Collins took note. I'll need the name and address of that shop. Peter nodded. Before the questioning could continue, a sudden sound echoed through the hall. The door opened. All heads turned. A woman stood at the entrance, dressed entirely in black. Her posture was rigid, her expression unreadable. Inspector Collins stepped forward. Mrs. Margaret Blake. She walked in slowly, her heels echoing against the wooden floor. You've heard? The inspector asked. I have, she replied coldly. Her gaze moved briefly toward the stage, toward where her husband's body had been taken. There are procedures, Collins began, and questions. She cut him off. Perhaps, she said, her voice sharp. He should have died the day he chose dishonesty over decency. The words struck the room like a sudden chill. Hastings whispered, Good Lord. Inspector Collins narrowed his eyes. That's a strong statement, Mrs. Blake. She did not respond, but Poirot was watching her, not her face, but something else. Her sleeve, a single loose thread, white against the dark fabric. Small, insignificant to most, but not to him. Ah, Poirot murmured almost inaudibly. Margaret folded her arms, her expression unmoved. Inspector Collins turned back to the students. Lucy, he said, you mentioned earlier that Mr. Blake had been under some stress recently. Lucy nodded quickly. Yes, sir, he seemed distracted, not himself. In what way? I don't know exactly, just uneasy. Did he mention anyone? Any trouble? She shook her head. Before Collins could continue, Peter spoke again. Sir, there's something else. The inspector looked at him. Go on. Before the performance, Peter said, I saw something near Mr. Blake's case. What was it? A white flower. Silence. Poirot's head tilted slightly. Inspector Collins frowned. A flower? Yes, sir. I remember because it seemed out of place. It wasn't there earlier. And now? Collins asked. Peter shook his head. It's gone. Poirot rose slowly from his seat. At last, he spoke aloud. Like the flowers outside, he said calmly. All eyes turned to him. Hastings blinked. Outside? Poirot nodded. Along the path, crushed, scattered, leading away from the stage. Inspector Collins crossed his arms. You believe they're connected? Poirot met his gaze. I do not believe, Inspector, he said gently. I observe. A pause, then he added, and what I observe suggests movement, a path, a direction. Margaret's eyes flickered just briefly. Poirot noticed. Of course, he noticed. Inspector Collins turned back to his notes. So far, he said, we have a repaired instrument handled by 2 students, a glass with traces of blood, a handkerchief marked with the letter C, and now a missing flower. He looked up. And a victim, who may not have been as respected as he appeared. The silence deepened. Poirot stepped forward slightly, his hands clasped behind his back. Inspector, he said, it would be wise to question everyone present. Collins nodded. That's the plan? Poirot inclined his head. Because, he added quietly, the truth does not hide far. His gaze moved slowly across the room, over the students, over Margaret, over every uneasy face in the hall. Then softly, with quiet certainty, the one who ended Mr. Blake's life is here. A faint tremor passed through the room. Hastings exhaled slowly, and somewhere, deep within the silence, suspicion began to take root. Chapter 4. The House of Secrets. The following morning arrived under a pale, subdued sky. A thin mist lingered over the quiet lanes of Havenbridge, softening the outlines of cottages and hedgerows, as though the village itself wished to blur the memory of the previous night. A motorcar moved slowly through one of the narrower roads, its tires crunching softly over gravel. Inside sat Inspector Collins, his expression thoughtful, and beside him, composed as ever, Hercule Poirot. Neither man spoke for some time. At last, the car came to a halt before a modest but time-worn Victorian cottage. Its structure bore the marks of age, weathered stone, ivy creeping along its walls, and windows that seemed to hold more history than light. In the small garden, clusters of flowers bloomed in quiet defiance of the sombre mood. Among them, white blossoms stood out, delicate, untouched, almost luminous in the morning haze. Poirot noticed them immediately. "Ah," he said softly, "les fleurs blanches. Once again, they make their appearance." Inspector Collins followed his gaze. "You think they're important?" Poirot gave a faint, enigmatic smile. "In a case such as this, Inspector, nothing repeats itself without reason." They approached the front door. Before Collins could knock, it opened. Mrs. Margaret Blake stood there. In daylight, her appearance was even more striking, not because of beauty, but because of the strain etched across her features. Her face was pale, her eyes slightly swollen, as though sleep had not visited her. Yet there was something else as well, a restraint, a controlled stillness that did not quite align with grief. "Inspector," she said, her voice measured. "And Monsieur Poirot, I presume?" Poirot inclined his head politely. "Madame." She stepped aside. "Please, come in." The interior of the house felt heavy with memory. Photographs lined the walls, formal portraits, candid moments, glimpses of a life that had once been orderly, perhaps even happy. Musical trophies occupied shelves and cabinets, silent reminders of Mr. Blake's accomplishments. The drawing room was modest but carefully arranged. A piano stood near the far wall, its polished surface reflecting the muted light from the window. On top of it lay an open diary. Poirot's eyes moved toward it almost immediately. "May I?" he asked gently. Margaret gave a small nod. Poirot stepped closer, his movements unhurried. He glanced down at the open page. For a moment he said nothing, then quietly he read aloud, "Do not betray me, Blake, or the consequences will be severe." The words seemed to linger in the air long after he spoke them. Inspector Collins frowned. A threat. Margaret's expression did not change. He received many messages, some from students, others less innocent. The inspector turned to her. Was there another woman in his life? She met his gaze without hesitation. "There was always another woman," she said, coldly. "A student. Music was only ever the excuse. Hastings was not present, yet one could almost imagine his reaction." Inspector Collins made a note. "Do you have a name?" Margaret hesitated. "Just briefly." "Then Clara." Poirot, who had been quietly observing the room, turned his head slightly. "Clara," he prompted. "Clara Hensley," Margaret replied. The name settled into the room like a piece of a puzzle, one that did not yet fully fit. Poirot's attention shifted again. Near the door, resting on a small wooden chair, was a basket. Inside were a few personal items, a scarf, a small bottle of perfume, and a neatly folded handkerchief. Poirot approached it. "Curious," he murmured. He lifted the handkerchief carefully. In one corner, embroidered in fine stitching, were two letters. C.H. Inspector Collins stepped closer. "The same initial as the one we found at the hall, except this one is complete." "Indeed," Poirot said. "From a single letter to a full identity." Margaret watched silently. "You recognize it?" the inspector asked her. She nodded. It belongs to Clara. Poirot studied her face, not her words, but the subtle movements beneath them. Madame, he said gently, you mentioned that you dismissed this Clara from your home. Margaret's lips tightened slightly. I did. Why? I saw them together, she said, her voice dropping. I made it clear she was no longer welcome. Poirot inclined his head, a most understandable reaction. Yet his tone suggested he was thinking beyond the obvious. Inspector Collins closed his notebook. This gives us a direction. Perhaps, Poirot replied. He moved toward the window, his gaze drifting outside. The garden lay just beyond, quiet, undisturbed, and there, once again, the white flowers. He stepped out. The morning air was cool, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and petals. Poirot crouched slightly, examining the flowers more closely. Identical, he murmured. The same variety as those found near the hall. Inspector Collins joined him. So they came from here. Or from someone who had access to them, Poirot corrected gently. He straightened, brushing a speck of dust from his sleeve. Inspector, he said, we now have a threatened man, a possible lover, and a trail that connects the house to the scene of the crime. Collins nodded. And a suspect, perhaps more than one. Poirot gave a small smile. Ah, suspects are plentiful, he said. Truth, however, is singular. He turned back toward the house, his expression thoughtful. One more thing, he added. The instrument. Inspector Collins looked at him. The guitar? Yes, Poirot said. It was repaired. Altered, perhaps? You think the shot might tell us something? I think, Poirot replied, that the hands which touched that instrument may have shaped more than music. A silence followed. The mist had begun to lift, revealing the village more clearly. But clarity, Poirot knew, was often deceptive. He cast one final glance at the white flowers, swaying gently in the morning breeze. Delicate, beautiful, and somehow connected to death. Come, Inspector, he said at last, we must follow the melody to its source. Chapter 5. The Funeral Truth. 2 days later, Havenbridge wore a different kind of silence. The sky was overcast, a dull grey stretching endlessly above the village, as though even the heavens had chosen restraint over light. A faint chill lingered in the air, carrying with it the subdued tolling of church bells, slow, measured, and mournful. In the churchyard, a small gathering had formed. Men and women stood dressed in black, their heads bowed, their voices hushed. The usual warmth of village familiarity had been replaced by distance, uncertainty. Suspicion, though unspoken, seemed to pass quietly between them. At the centre of it all lay the coffin of Mr. Blake. Simple, still, final. Standing a little apart from the others were Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings. Hastings watched the proceedings with a solemn expression, while Poirot remained composed, his eyes not on the coffin, but on the people. Such occasions, Poirot murmured softly, often reveal more than they conceal. Hastings glanced at him. You think someone here knows something? Poirot's gaze moved slowly across the crowd. I think, he said, that grief wears many faces, and not all of them are genuine. Nearby stood the 4 students, Edward, Lucy, Peter, and Anna. Their black attire did little to unify them. Edward stood rigid, his jaw clenched. Lucy appeared visibly shaken, her hands clasped tightly together. Peter shifted uneasily, while Anna kept her eyes fixed on the ground. A short distance away, Margaret Blake stood alone. Her face was pale, her posture controlled, but her eyes, sharp, observant, betrayed something deeper than sorrow. The ceremony proceeded in quiet dignity. Words were spoken, prayers offered, and the final rites performed. Then, slowly, the gathering began to disperse. It was at this moment that Inspector Collins approached Poirot, a folded document in his hand. "The post-mortem report has arrived," he said, in a low voice. Hastings straightened slightly, and Inspector Collins glanced at the paper before speaking. "Mr. Blake did not die from the blow to the head." A brief silence followed. Poirot's eyes narrowed just a fraction. "Continue, Inspector." "The cause of death," Collins said, "was poison." Hastings blinked. "Poison?" "Yes," the inspector replied. "A fast-acting toxin. It entered the bloodstream through the cuts on his fingers." Poirot nodded slowly as though confirming a thought already formed. "The strings," he said quietly. Inspector Collins inclined his head. "Exactly. The strings of the instrument were coated with the substance. When Blake played, the cuts allowed the poison to enter his system." Hastings exhaled sharply. "Good Lord." Poirot remained calm. "Then we are dealing," he said, "with a most deliberate design." Inspector Collins continued. "The head injury, while severe, was not immediately fatal. It may have been intended to reinforce the appearance of an accident." "A second method," Poirot said, "to ensure the outcome." Collins folded the report. "Two methods, one victim. Whoever did this wanted certainty." Poirot's gaze drifted briefly toward the coffin. "Or perhaps," he said softly, "they wanted concealment." Hastings looked puzzled. "Concealment?" Poirot turned to him. "If one method fails, the other succeeds. If one is discovered, the other misleads. It is thorough." Inspector Collins nodded. "We questioned the students again this morning." "And?" Poirot asked. "They deny any knowledge of a Clara Hensley." Poirot's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "None of them?" he asked. "None," Collins confirmed. "They insist no such person was ever part of the class." Hastings frowned. "But Mrs. Blake was certain." "Indeed," Poirot said. He took a moment before speaking again. "Then we are presented with a contradiction," he continued. "Either Mrs. Blake has been misled, or she has misled us." Inspector Collins crossed his arms. "You think she could have invented the name?" "It is possible," Poirot replied. "A convenient identity, one that draws suspicion away from herself." Hastings considered this. "But the handkerchief, the initial CH, that would support her claim, wouldn't it?" Poirot gave a faint smile. "Or it would support the illusion." A pause. Then he added, "Evidence, Hastings, is only as honest as the person who places it." Inspector Collins exhaled slowly. "So we may be looking at deliberate misdirection." "Precisely." For a moment the three men stood in silence, each absorbed in thought. In the distance, the last of the mourners began to leave the churchyard. The bell rang once more, then fell quiet. Poirot spoke again. "There is something else," he said. Inspector Collins looked at him. "Yes?" "The instrument," Poirot continued. "It was repaired shortly before the incident." Collins nodded. "We've confirmed that. Edward and Peter took it to a shop." "And returned it themselves," Poirot added. "Yes." Poirot clasped his hands behind his back, his posture thoughtful. "Then," he said, "the instrument spent time away from its owner." Hastings' eyes widened slightly. "You think it was altered during that time?" Poirot glanced at him. "I think," he said carefully, "that opportunity often disguises itself as routine." Inspector Collins made another note. "We'll speak to the shop owner again." "Yes," Poirot agreed, "but do not expect too much from that direction." Collins raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" Poirot's expression softened into a knowing smile. "Because," he said, "the truth rarely lies with strangers, when it can be found among those closest to the victim." Hastings followed his gaze. The students were now moving toward the gate. Margaret Blake remained where she was, still, watching. Poirot's voice dropped slightly. "We have examined the scene," he said. "We have followed the trail. Now we must understand the people." Inspector Collins nodded. "You're suggesting we visit their homes?" "We?" Poirot replied. "Their surroundings, their habits, their relationships. These will tell us far more than their words." Hastings straightened. "Then we begin at once?" Poirot gave a small nod. "Yes," he said. "The next movement of this symphony must begin." He took one last look at the coffin, then turned away. As they walked toward the church gate, the wind stirred gently, carrying with it the faint scent of white flowers. And somewhere, beneath the quiet surface of grief, the truth waited. Chapter 6. The Visit. The following morning dawned with a pale, uncertain light. Havenbridge seemed quieter than usual, as though the events of the past days had settled into its very stones. A thin breeze moved through the narrow lanes, carrying with it the faint rustle of leaves and something else. A tension that had not yet found release. Seated beside Inspector Collins in the motor car, Hercule Poirot adjusted his gloves with quiet precision. Across from him, Captain Hastings looked out of the window, his thoughts clearly occupied. "We begin with the students," Inspector Collins said, glancing briefly at Poirot. "If the instrument is the key, then whoever handled it last must be important." Poirot inclined his head slightly. "Quite so, Inspector. The instrument, like the crime itself, has passed through certain hands. It is those hands we must examine, not merely what they touched, but why." Hastings turned back toward him. "You believe one of them is responsible?" Poirot's expression remained calm. "I believe, Hastings, that the truth lies very near us. Whether it is seen, that is another matter." The car slowed as they approached their first stop. A modest house stood at the edge of a quiet lane, Peter's residence. Its appearance was simple, almost unremarkable. Yet there was a certain neatness to it, as though its occupant valued order. Inspector Collins stepped out and knocked. After a moment, the door opened. Peter stood there, his expression tense but composed. "Inspector," he said, stepping aside. "Please, come in." The interior of the house was tidy, though somewhat sparse. A few books lay neatly stacked, and a small table stood by the window, its surface cleared with almost deliberate care. Inspector Collins wasted no time. "Peter," he began, "we need you to go over the events once more, particularly regarding the instrument." Peter nodded quickly. "Of course, sir." He hesitated for a moment before continuing. "The day before the concert," he said, "Edward had the guitar. He told me he would keep it overnight and bring it to the hall in the morning." Poirot's gaze sharpened, though his expression did not change. "So," he said softly, "the instrument spent the night at Edward's house?" Peter nodded. "Yes." Inspector Collins made a note. "And you did not see it again until the concert?" "No, sir." Poirot exchanged a brief glance with the inspector. "Merci," he said quietly. "That will be all, for now." As they left Peter's house, Hastings spoke in a low voice. "That seems significant." Poirot gave a faint smile. "It is not merely significant, Hastings. It is illuminating." Their next stop lay a short distance away. Anna's home was smaller, more modest, yet there was a lived-in warmth to it. The curtains were drawn slightly open, allowing soft light to enter. Anna greeted them with visible unease. "Inspector." "Monsieur Poirot?" "Miss Anna," Collins said, "we would like to ask you a few more questions." She nodded and led them inside. The room bore signs of daily life: books, a teacup left half-finished, a shawl draped over a chair. Yet beneath it all was a nervous energy, as though something unsaid lingered in the air. Inspector Collins spoke gently. "You mentioned earlier that there had been tension between Mr. Blake and his wife." Anna hesitated. Then quietly she said, "It was more than tension, sir." Poirot watched her closely. "Explain, if you please," he said. Anna clasped her hands together. "A few days before the concert," she said, "there was an argument, a serious one." Inspector Collins leaned forward slightly. "Between Mr. Blake and Mrs. Blake?" Anna shook her head. "No, sir. Between Mrs. Blake and someone else." Poirot's eyes narrowed just slightly. "Continue." Anna took a breath. "Mrs. Blake, she lost control. She grabbed someone by the throat. We saw it, all of us." Hastings looked startled. "Good heavens!" Inspector Collins exchanged a glance with Poirot. "And this was witnessed by the students?" "Yes," Anna replied. "We were all there." A silence followed. Poirot spoke at last. "Strong emotion," he said softly. "Jealousy, perhaps, or fear." Anna lowered her gaze. "Perhaps both," she whispered. After a few more questions, they took their leave. Back in the car, Hastings turned to Poirot. "That certainly casts suspicion on Mrs. Blake." Poirot did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked out of the window, his expression thoughtful. "Suspicion," he said at last, "is easily cast, but truth requires precision." Their final visit brought them to the edge of the village. Edward's home stood slightly apart from the others, a small cottage, modest in size, yet surrounded by signs of careful maintenance. As they approached, the door opened before they could knock. A man stood there, tall, stern, his expression unwelcoming. "Inspector," he said sharply, "what is this about?" "Mr. Hartley," Collins replied, "we need to speak with your son." The man's eyes hardened. "I told him music was a waste of time. Business, that is what matters." But he would not listen, nor would his mother. Poirot observed him silently. There was something in the man's tone, not merely irritation, but control, authority edged with impatience. They were led inside. Edward stood near the far wall, his posture rigid. Seated nearby was his mother, Clara. She did not look up immediately. When she did, her face was pale, her expression distant. There was a small mark near her temple, a faint injury. Poirot noticed it at once. "Madame," he said gently, "you have been hurt." She touched her temple instinctively. "It is nothing." I slipped. Poirot said nothing, but his gaze lingered a moment longer than necessary. Then something else caught his attention. In the corner of the room, partially concealed, stood a guitar. He stepped closer. "Ah," he murmured. "How familiar?" Edward spoke quickly. "It's mine. I bought it recently." Poirot inclined his head. "Of course." But his eyes suggested he was not entirely convinced. The visit concluded with formalities. As they stepped outside, Poirot paused. Near the door stood a small dustbin. He glanced into it, briefly, casually. Then he stopped. Inside lay a small bottle, partially hidden. Its label faded, but unmistakable. Poirot's expression did not change. He turned slightly, catching Inspector Collins's eye. A silent understanding passed between them. Hastings noticed the exchange. "Poirot?" But Poirot simply adjusted his gloves. "Come, my friend," he said quietly. As they walked away, the wind stirred once more. Behind them, the house stood silent, but within it, the final note of the mystery had already begun to form. Chapter 7. The final note. By late afternoon, the Havenbridge village hall had once again filled with people, but this time there was no music, no laughter, no expectation of entertainment. The atmosphere was heavy, expectant, and deeply uneasy. Every chair was occupied, every whisper hushed, as though the very walls themselves were listening. At the front of the hall stood Inspector Collins, his posture firm, his expression resolute. Beside him, calm and composed as ever, was Hercule Poirot. Slightly behind them stood Captain Hastings, watching the room with quiet intensity. The four students, Edward, Lucy, Peter, and Anna, stood together once more, though the distance between them now felt greater than ever. Margaret Blake stood apart, her arms folded, her gaze sharp and unyielding. Near the back, Clara Hartley sat silently, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. His voice was calm, controlled, yet carried clearly through the hall. "We are gathered here not merely to mourn the passing of Mr. Blake, but to understand the manner of his death." A pause. This was not an accident. The words settled heavily. This was a crime, one executed with precision, with planning, and with purpose. Hastings watched as the room seemed to draw inward, every listener caught within Poirot's quiet authority. Poirot continued, "We have before us several facts." Inspector Collins stepped forward. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "This gathering is not for speculation, but for truth." A murmur passed briefly through the room, before fading into silence again. He turned slightly toward Poirot. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "if you would." Poirot inclined his head and stepped forward. For a moment he said nothing. He simply looked. His gaze moved slowly across the room, over each face, each expression, each flicker of fear or defiance. It was as though he were not merely seeing them, but measuring them. Then at last, he spoke. "Mesdames et messieurs," he raised a hand slightly, as though arranging the pieces of an invisible puzzle. First, the instrument. Its strings were sharpened, altered, and coated with poison. A ripple of shock moved through the audience. Second, the victim's wounds. The cuts upon his fingers allowed that poison to enter his bloodstream. Another pause. Third, the blow to the head, not the cause of death, but an attempt to disguise it. Inspector Collins nodded subtly, confirming the statement. Poirot's gaze shifted toward the students. And finally, the matter of opportunity, he began to walk slowly, his steps measured. The instrument was taken for repair and returned by two individuals. He stopped. Edward and Peter. Peter's face paled slightly, but he said nothing. Poirot turned. "But," he continued, "the instrument did not remain in both their care." His eyes fixed on Edward. "It spent the night in the possession of one." A silence fell, sharp and immediate. Edward's jaw tightened. Poirot took a step closer. "Edward Hartley," he said quietly, "you had both the means and the opportunity." "No," Edward's voice broke through the silence. "That's not true." Poirot did not raise his voice. Instead, he spoke with even greater calm. "Let us consider the motive." He turned slightly, his gaze now moving toward Clara. "Your mother," he said gently, "was connected to Mr. Blake." A flicker of emotion crossed Edward's face. Poirot continued. "You knew of this connection. You saw her distress, her humiliation, her suffering." Edward shook his head. "Stop!" "You saw your father's anger," Poirot said, his voice still controlled, and the violence that followed. Clara covered her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. Poirot's tone sharpened, just slightly. "And you saw Mr. Blake?" "Continue." The room was utterly still. "You loved your mother," Poirot said softly. "And in that love, something darker took root." Edward's breathing had become uneven. "You planned it," Poirot continued. "Carefully, quietly." He gestured faintly. "The poison, hidden upon the strings. A method that would not draw immediate suspicion." Inspector Collins stepped forward slightly. "And the bottle?" he added. "Found in your possession." Edward's eyes flickered, just for a moment. Poirot saw it. Of course he saw it. "But," Poirot said, "there was a flaw in your plan." He moved closer still. "When the moment came, you could not remain distant." Edward's voice trembled. "I didn't. You saw him playing," Poirot said. "You saw him alive, unaffected, and your control broke." A long pause. "Did it not?" Silence. Then, "You went backstage." Poirot's voice had lowered now, almost intimate. "You approached him, and you pushed him." A sharp intake of breath echoed somewhere in the hall. Edward's shoulders slumped. The defiance in his expression faltered. For a moment, he said nothing. Then weakly, "No." But even as he spoke, the denial lacked strength. Poirot stepped back. "The evidence," he said quietly, "does not lie." Inspector Collins moved forward, his tone firm. "Edward Hartley," he said, "you are accused of the murder of Mr. Blake." The room seemed to hold its breath. All eyes were on Edward, and in that moment, the truth stood exposed, unavoidable, inevitable. Chapter 8. The Confession. The silence inside the Havenbridge village hall felt heavier than anything that had come before it. It was no longer the silence of suspense or anticipation, it was the silence of conclusion. Every breath, every movement seemed restrained, as though the room itself was reluctant to disturb what had just been revealed. At the center of it all stood Edward Hartley. His shoulders were lowered now. The rigid posture he had maintained throughout the investigation had finally collapsed, as though the weight of everything, fear, anger, guilt, had become too much to carry. His hands trembled slightly at his sides. Nearby, Inspector Collins watched him closely, ready to act, while Hercule Poirot remained still, his expression calm but distant, as though the final outcome had already been understood long before it was spoken aloud. Captain Hastings stood quietly behind Poirot, his face marked with a mixture of shock and reluctant acceptance. Edward swallowed hard. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, in a voice that barely carried across the hall, he spoke. "I confess." A faint murmur passed through the room, quickly suppressed. Edward lifted his head slightly, though his eyes avoided the crowd. "I did it," he said again, more firmly this time, as if forcing the words out of something deep and buried. "I killed Mr. Blake." Inspector Collins stepped forward. "State the circumstances." Edward's jaw tightened. His voice shook, but he continued. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," he said. "I didn't want this." Poirot observed him silently, his gaze steady but unreadable. Edward continued, words now spilling faster. "He destroyed everything," Edward said. "My mother, my family." A flicker of emotion crossed Clara Hartley's face at the mention of her name, but she did not interrupt. Edward's voice rose slightly. "He came into our home. He lied. He manipulated her. He made her believe things, and then he turned it all into humiliation." Inspector Collins remained firm. "And the instrument?" Edward looked down. "I prepared it," he admitted. A sharp silence followed. Poirot finally spoke, his tone gentle but precise. "Explain." Edward hesitated. Then he began. "The guitar was in the shop," he said. "I made sure I was the one who collected it. I told Peter I would handle it." Peter, standing nearby, looked away. Edward continued. "I kept it overnight," he said. "At my house." His voice grew quieter. "I applied the poison to the strings." A collective tension rippled through the hall. Inspector Collins frowned. "And the reason for poison?" Edward's face twisted slightly. "I wanted it to look like an accident," he said. "A mistake. Something no one would question." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing. Edward exhaled shakily. "But I didn't account for everything," he continued. I didn't think it would act so quickly." He looked up briefly. "When he started playing, I could see it happening. The cuts, the blood." His voice faltered. "And then I panicked." A pause. Poirot's voice came softly. "You went backstage?" Edward nodded weakly. "I couldn't stop it," he said. I just reacted." Inspector Collins pressed further. "You pushed him?" Edward closed his eyes. "Yes." A silence followed that seemed to stretch endlessly. Outside, somewhere in the village, a faint wind moved through the trees. Inside the hall, no one moved. Poirot stepped forward slightly. "Not out of calculation," he said gently. "Out of emotion." Edward looked at him, confused. Poirot continued. "You did not act as a strategist, Edward Hartley. You acted as a son." Those words seemed to land differently in the room. Clara's hand rose to her mouth again. Edward's shoulders shook slightly. "I didn't mean to kill him," he whispered. "I just wanted him to stop." Inspector Collins looked at him for a long moment. Then he signalled to the constables. Edward did not resist. As they stepped forward, he lowered his head completely. "I did it for her," he said softly, almost to himself. "For my mother." Clara let out a small broken sound, but still said nothing. Poirot watched as Edward was led away. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction, only quiet understanding. When the door closed behind Edward, the atmosphere in the hall shifted again, subtle but undeniable. Something had ended. Inspector Collins exhaled slowly. "It's over." Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned slightly toward the stage, the place where everything had begun. "Over?" he repeated softly. Hastings frowned. "Isn't it?" Poirot's gaze lingered for a moment longer. "An investigation," he said carefully, "may conclude, but the consequences of human emotion do not end so neatly." A silence followed. Inspector Collins closed his notebook. "We have our culprit. That is what matters legally." Poirot nodded slightly. "Legally," he agreed. But he did not move. His eyes shifted briefly toward Clara Hartley, who still stood in place, her face pale and unreadable. Then toward Margaret Blake, distant and composed. Then back to the empty space where Edward had stood. Finally, he spoke again. "Justice," Poirot said quietly, "is not always a single note." Hastings looked at him. "What do you mean?" Poirot adjusted his gloves, his voice calm and reflective. "Sometimes," he said, "it is a composition, many voices, many emotions, each one contributing to the final outcome." He turned slightly. "And in this case," he added, "every person in this room has played a part in the melody that led to tragedy." Inspector Collins watched him for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Perhaps. But the law deals with actions, not melodies." Poirot gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "No," he said softly. "The law does not. But truth does." For a moment no one spoke. Then slowly, the tension in the room began to ease. Not fully, but enough for movement to return, for breath to feel lighter. Outside, the wind picked up slightly. Somewhere beyond the hall, white flowers swayed gently in the fading light. Poirot turned toward the exit. "Hastings," he said quietly. "Yes?" "The case is finished." A pause, then more softly. "But the music it revealed will linger."
If you enjoy our story, then like and subscribe our channel.